The state of Kansas touts its efforts to battle racial bias as innovative and effective.
But we found some of that reporting is coming up short. Tonight, Cake News investigator Pilar Pedraza begins a week-long series, Kansas Law and Order.
When the police get behind me, my heart still skips a beat.
Last December, Bryce Graham told Cake News Investigates how he plans his route to work and picks out his car based on what he thinks will help him avoid police.
We all know in the community that if you drive an old school vehicle, you're a lot more likely to be pulled over by the police.
9 years ago, state lawmakers set up a new racial bias reporting system to help address those concerns. It requires local law enforcement and the Attorney General to publicly record racial bias complaints and the results of their investigations. But how departments report needs some work.
Some do exactly what the statute says and no more. Others decide to give a much more complete narrative, which is not prohibited, but it's not mandated either.
Take a look as we scroll through the more than 800 bias complaints since 2012. Investigations have only upheld 7 of them, and it's hard to tell why. The language used is far from consistent in these reports. Some agencies provide detail. Most don't, simply saying sustained or some variation of investigated, exonerated, or unfounded, with no explanation.
Why is there this discrepancy, and is there a way to standardize it?
At the end of the day, the legislature has to set, here are the parameters. Here's what must be collected, and here's what must be reported, and here's the format.
So what happens after that initial investigation? Well, again, there's no standard next step. Sometimes it ends with the local department's efforts. But the Attorney General could also send it on to a group called CPOST.
The Kansas Commission on Peace Officer Standards and Training. We conduct those investigations with the purpose of the potential for taking disciplinary actions on their certifications.
In other words, CPOST can take problem cops off the streets permanently, but many of the complaints of bias never make it to CPOST.
We receive about 5 complaints per year from the Attorney General's office.
That's out of the average 90 complaints filed, like this one. In the Osawatomie Police Department, the investigation found the officer acted with racial bias and simply put the officer on probation. Another out of Topeka found the allegations to be true, but determined whatever happened didn't fall under Kansas law. Of the investigations that did make it to CPOST,
we have not found bias-based policing in any case.
While CPOST can take an officer's badge for felonies and 58 misdemeanors, racial bias doesn't guarantee the loss of a badge.
Let me also say that we believe that bias-based policing occurs.
That belief is why activists like Dr. Willie Scott are pushing for change.
What actually goes on? Where is the transparency? We don't see anything, and that's what we want to see, what's actually happening, and not just what you want to tell us. I believe this is a law that we need to go back and we need to revisit.
The Kansas Attorney General agrees this law and others like it could use an update. He's already asked the KBI to start studying similar issues with the collection of use of force data. Pilar Pedraza, Cake News investigates.
And the fact that Kansas has an agency like CPOST puts our state ahead of many others. Since 2012, Kansas has decertified 355 officers, Minnesota 31. They're called wandering officers, officers who've been in trouble at one law enforcement agency who just pick up and move to another.
Tonight in our series Kansas Law and Order, Cake News investigator Pilar Pedraza shows how Kansas is handling this group of wandering officers.
All around the country,
shot and killed 12-year-old Tamir Rice.
Rogue officers work among us.
Timothy Lohman, who resigned from a nearby police department,
moving from department to department,
be declared unfit for duty,
leaving a trail of tears in their wake.
I noticed this pattern, which is in a surprising number of the media accounts of police-involved shootings. At the end, you'd see a line there that says this police officer had previously been fired by another agency.
Duke Associate Law Professor Ben Grunwald has put a spotlight on a unique group of law enforcement officers, a group that includes the officer who shot and killed 12-year-old Tamir Rice. Just a year before, an officer in South Carolina shot and killed the town's former mayor. It was his 4th department.
Police officers who've been fired in the past who get another job are twice as likely to be fired again, twice as likely to receive a moral character violations for violent and sexual misconduct.
Cases like these are numerous. Grunwald and his co-author John Rappaport studied the phenomenon in a paper they published in April. They specifically looked at officers in Florida and found at any one time the state has 1,100 wandering officers in the line of duty. Can this happen in Kansas? They say absolutely.
Police officers can slip through these decertification databases by not getting decertified, which is very common. And then even if they get fired and you're tracking firings, they can get through the firing databases too, because they can leave while they're being investigated.
Decertification is when the state strips an officer of his badge and ability to work in law enforcement. Kansas CPOST Director Gary Steed is the one who signs the original certificates officers receive in order to hit the streets. He says wandering officers are not welcome and credits a national database for Kansas' success.
The National Decertification Index is a nationwide database that posts the certifications, actions against all officers in other states. It's an imperfect system. If an officer is decertified in another state, they don't have the ability to become certified here in Kansas.
It's worked well in the past. Just this year, an officer out of Missouri tried applying at Baxter Springs Police Department, but was stopped because of that very database. Another officer who never made 6 months in one Kansas department applied at another agency. The application denied.
And I believe we have a good system in place to root out bad actors.
Kansas Attorney General Derek Schmidt says the state only requires a department to put a police officer through a criminal background check before hiring them. It does not require departments to use a hiring and firing database that's kept over at CPOST.
Should it be mandatory that every agency before hiring an officer should have to check their history with CPOST?
But yes, I think that ought to be a standard part of a background check for the new job.
The departments most likely to forego those hiring checks, small rural police agencies, often the target departments of wandering officers.
When a wandering officer lands a new job, they tend to move to agencies that are smaller, with fewer resources, that serve communities that have slightly larger communities of color.
While Kansas is ahead of the curve compared to other states when it comes to tracking, hiring, and firing of police officers, Grunwald says the only way to really prevent these officers from infiltrating agencies is a national hiring and firing database.
Police officers get fired frequently, but they rarely get decertified.
While there is no national database to track officers from department to department, the CPOST database here in Kansas that tracks why officers move around is available to any law enforcement agency in the nation. Pilar Pedraza, Cake News, investigates.
Epic. Can just yelling that one word prevent police violence? That's the premise behind one training program beginning to sweep the nation.
Cake News investigator Pilar Pedraza continues her week-long series, Kansas Law and Order, with a look at how it works and who's using it.
The introduction of dash cams and body cams over the last couple of decades, they say, has changed how they hold each other accountable. But the purpose of Epic is to catch any misbehaviors before they even have a chance to happen.
From the simply inappropriate to the downright criminal, the developer of Epic says this training program can prevent tragedies like George Floyd's death last May. An 8-minute, 46-second deadly confrontation with Minneapolis police that sparked a nationwide call for reform this year. A call that has activists and police departments right here in Kansas sitting down to talk about what needs to change.
Whenever something happens, we evolve, we adjust, or whatever. And it's something that we do continually. And so when people talk about police reform, I don't view it as a negative term.
Topeka Police Chief Bill Cochran says he was already working to make his department the first in Kansas to bring in EPIC, which stands for Ethical Policing is Courageous.
The title kind of caught my attention.
EPIC and its successor ABLE are based around individual officers holding each other accountable.
Unnecessary harm can be prevented by fellow officers intervening.
Even when it's a rookie calling out a supervisor, something Dr. Irvin Staub says could have prevented George Floyd's death and did prevent serious injury in this incident in Seattle just 3 days later, when one officer physically pushed another officer's knee off a suspect's neck after verbal warnings didn't lead to a change in position.
And so that's what it's really about, is to give the officers a skill set to identify things early on before negative things take place.
Staub developed the program after spending a lifetime studying how bystanders react to crises.
As a young child, I survived the Holocaust, and there were in Hungary, and there were active bystanders who helped us.
New Orleans, one of the most notorious police departments in the country with at least one former officer now on death row, was the first to put EPIC into practice back in 2014.
We together will do everything in our power to make sure that the culture of violence in this city is transformed once and for all.
Now, the department reports, the simple act of yelling EPIC is enough to get an officer to change course. Since then, the number of times New Orleans officers were involved in what the police department calls a critical incident, where a civilian's life is in serious danger, has fallen from 17 in 2013 to just 5 in 2018, the most recent year on record. In fact, in 2018, New Orleans officers only fired their weapons 4 times, twice accidentally, twice to shoot a dog, never at a person. That's the record that's attracting the attention of law enforcement agencies around the country.
Individuals in law enforcement, police officers, sheriff's deputies, agents, whatever they are, they're still human beings.
Staub says interest in this sort of training has quadrupled since George Floyd's death, as law enforcement agencies work to reconnect with communities that just don't trust them right now.
Black Lives Matter! The Topeka Police Department began its training in EPIC a couple of weeks ago and hopes to have the program fully deployed by the beginning of next year. Pilar Pedraza, Cake News, investigates.
Neighborhood Watch that watches the police. It's one way residents in some cities are working to make sure law enforcement officers live up to community standards.
Cake's Pilar Pedraza continues her week-long look at law and order in Kansas.
Now, once I find it out, I don't know.
Even as officers patrol city streets across the country, members of a group called Copwatch have been following them, recording their interactions with the public.
We're not there to interfere, we're simply there to document.
Mariah Yates is with the original Copwatch organization in Berkeley, California, founded in 1990. They train volunteers to patrol their own neighborhood streets, teaching them everything from their rights to record police actions to how far back they need to stay and how to write up a report on what they saw.
And every time we film something, we have somebody filming the incident, and then we have someone filming the person.
Violation of policy and practice. All those records then put into a database that they can go back and check later if there are any questions or complaints about the interaction. Yates points to all the cases of police action that have raised public anger in recent years.
Black Lives Matter!
Because someone caught them on video. As proof the concept works.
It's not our goal to catch things like that. We hope that through being there and being present, that those sorts of incidences can be avoided.
The idea has spread across the country, including an unaffiliated organization with a similar name here in Wichita and a group called Cop Block in Kansas City, all with similar goals. Just how well these citizen patrols work may have something to do with how long the system has been in place.
I am positive that they are a much more well-behaved police department for having had a very strict citizen oversight committee.
Some cities have formalized this idea of citizen oversight of the police by putting citizen review boards in place, but studies have shown that it's difficult to tell just how effective these review boards are because no two work alike. Pilar Pedraza, Cake News, investigates.
Kansas policing deserves credit for being on the leading edge of police reform, but many people have pointed to holes in the existing laws.
Tonight, Cake News investigator Pilar Pedraza wraps up her week-long series, Kansas Law and Order, by talking with lawmakers about what's next.
Over the last week, we've shown you the impact of Kansas laws on police behavior and how different agencies are trying to make them stronger, like stopping the problem of officers wandering from department to department to avoid legal trouble, and tracking complaints of racial bias in policing. We've also shown you the loopholes we found in some of those laws.
Some do exactly what the statute says and no more. Others decide to give a much more complete narrative, which is not prohibited. but it's not mandated either.
We took those findings to state lawmakers on the House Judiciary Committee, who would likely be among the first to handle any such attempts to change state laws on policing.
There are bad eggs who do slip through the cracks.
Nobody wants bad cops. Okay, it serves no good.
They agree Kansas has come a long way in the last couple of decades, but that some laws likely need an update.
It really hits me deep in the gut to realize that on some level this goes on and that people have to endure that.
But say the how needs to come from the experts, like the Attorney General.
I'm very hopeful that the Attorney General will look at the work that you're doing here and bring suggestions that he can get behind so that we can close what loopholes may remain.
Some of that work is already underway between the Criminal Justice Reform Committee's study of racial disparities and the governor's Racial Equity and Justice Task Force. Lawmakers expect to see bills in this next legislative session stemming from the research those groups are doing right now.
Because at the end of the day, we want policing to be better. We want to ensure that we're taking the bad guys off of the streets, but that we're ensuring that it is the bad guys and that we're not making mistakes.
And as we mentioned earlier this week, the Attorney General already has investigators looking into ways to standardize reporting requirements for use of force incidents here in Kansas.
And I know their review in response to that request is underway. I'll be anxious to see what they recommend.
And lawmakers are expecting to see recommendations from those two research groups in the next few weeks, beginning the next phase of law and order reform here in Kansas. Pilar Pedraza, Cake News, investigates.